Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The sun had barely risen when Luca left the village, his sword strapped to his back, and his heart filled with both fear and hope. The path before him was steep and treacherous, winding its way up into the mountains where no one had ventured in generations. Yet, he knew that this was the only way to save his sister, Mira. Time was running out. Mira had always been the light of his life, the one person who had given him a sense of purpose after their parents had died. Her laughter had filled their small house with warmth, but now, it was quiet. The illness that had taken hold of her was relentless, draining the life from her little by little, and no healer in the village could help. Luca had sat by her bedside night after night, listening to her raspy breaths and watching her chest rise and fall, each time fearing it would be the last. It was the village elder who had told Luca about the ancient legend, about the light of wish, a stone said to grant the heart's deepest desire. The stone was hidden deep within a temple high in the mountains, guarded by ancient magic and powerful trials that only the worthy could pass. It was a place few had ever reached, and those who did rarely returned, but Luca had no choice. If there was even the faintest hope that the light of wish could save his sister, he had to try. As he walked along the narrow mountain path, the wind howling through the trees, Luca thought about Mira. She was always so full of life, chasing after him as a child, demanding he show her how to hold a sword. She had never been content with just watching. She wanted to be part of everything. He smiled at the memory, but his heart ached. He had to make it to the temple. He had to find the stone. The forest grew thicker as Luca ascended, the trees towering over him like silent sentinels. The air was cool, and the sunlight barely pierced the dense canopy. He could feel the weight of the journey pressing down on him, but he pressed on, his footsteps steady. The path became steeper, the terrain rougher. The further he climbed, the more he felt the presence of something ancient, something watching. Then, without warning, the trees thinned, and he found himself standing at the edge of the forest of shadows. The air here was colder, heavier, and a strange mist curled around the base of the trees. The elder had warned him about this place, about how it played tricks on the mind, showing people their deepest fears and regrets. Luca hesitated, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He wasn't afraid of what the forest might show him. He had faced fear before in battle, but he knew that here, it wouldn't be physical enemies he had to fight. It would be his own mind, steeling himself. Luca stepped into the forest. The mist swallowed him whole, and for a moment, he felt disoriented, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches reaching out like fingers. His breath caught in his throat, but he forced himself to keep moving. Then, the shadows began to shift. At first, they were just flickers at the edge of his vision, fleeting and insubstantial. But soon, they took form, and Luca realized he was no longer alone. Figures emerged from the mist, familiar figures. He saw his parents, their faces pale and gaunt, just as they had been before they died. They reached out to him, their eyes filled with sorrow. "You failed us, Luca," his mother's voice whispered. "You let us die." Luca's chest tightened, but he shook his head. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I did everything I could." The figures didn't fade. If anything, they became more real, more solid, until he could almost feel their cold hands on his skin. His father's eyes, once warm and full of pride, now bore into him with accusation. "You're going to fail Mira too," his father said, his voice low and menacing. "You'll let her die, just like you let us die." Luca clenched his fists, his knuckles white. He knew what this was. The forest of shadows was trying to break him, trying to make him believe that he wasn't strong enough. But he couldn't afford to fall into despair, not now. He drew his sword, the blade gleaming in the pale light of the mist. "I won't fail her," Luca said through gritted teeth. "I won't let her die." The figures wavered, their forms distorting as if they were made of smoke. His parents' faces twisted into something grotesque, their voices rising into a cacophony of accusations and screams. But Luca stood his ground. He raised his sword high and brought it down with a fierce cry, cutting through the illusion. The shadows dissipated, leaving only silence in their wake. Breathing heavily, Luca sheathed his sword. The forest seemed to relax, the oppressive weight of the mist lifting slightly. He had passed the first trial. But as he continued deeper into the forest, he knew that this was only the beginning. Hours passed, or perhaps it was days. Time had no meaning in the forest of shadows. But eventually, the trees began to thin, and the mist cleared. Luca emerged from the forest, his muscles aching and his mind weary, but his resolve stronger than ever. It was then that he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. Luca spun around, his hand going to his sword, but he relaxed when he saw a figure emerge from the shadows. It was a woman, her dark hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders, her eyes sharp and calculating. She was dressed in leather armor, and a bow was slung across her back. She looked like someone who had spent years surviving in the wild, her movements fluid and confident. "Who are you?" Luca asked, keeping his hand on his sword hilt. The woman raised an eyebrow, a small smirk playing on her lips. "The better question is, who are you?" "I'm Luca," he said warily. "I'm on my way to the Temple of Light." The woman's smirk faded slightly, and she studied him with renewed interest. "The Temple of Light, huh? Not many people brave enough to make that journey." Luca frowned. "And you? Are you headed there too?" The woman shrugged. "Maybe. Maybe not. The name's Allure, by the way." Luca wasn't sure what to make of her. She seemed capable, but there was something about her that put him on edge. Still, he couldn't afford to be picky about company, not on a journey like this. "I don't have time to waste," Luca said, turning back to the path ahead. "If you're coming, keep up." Allure chuckled softly but fell into step beside him. "I wouldn't worry about me keeping up, warrior boy. I've been through these mountains more times than you can imagine." They walked in silence for a while, the mountain path growing steeper with each step. The wind whipped around them, and the air grew colder as they ascended. Luca focused on putting one foot in front of the other, but his mind kept drifting back to his sister. He had to keep going. He had to save her. "You're looking for the Light of Wish, aren't you?" Allure asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Luca glanced at her, surprised. "How do you know?" Allure shrugged again. "It's the only reason anyone would come up this way. I've heard the legends. A stone that can grant any wish. Sounds too good to be true, if you ask me." Luca frowned. "You don't believe in it?" "Oh, I believe it exists," Allure said, her tone casual. "But I also believe that things like that come with a price. Nothing's free, Luca. Especially not wishes." Luca didn't respond. He didn't want to think about the possibility that the stone wouldn't work, that he had come all this way for nothing. He had to believe that it would save Mira. The path ahead began to narrow, the mountain rising sharply on one side and dropping away into a sheer cliff on the other. The Cliffs of Despair, they were called. Luca had heard stories about these cliffs, about how many had fallen to their deaths while trying to reach the temple. He swallowed hard, his grip tightening on his sword hilt. "Allure," he said quietly, "have you ever crossed these cliffs?" Allure gave him a sidelong glance, her expression unreadable. Once. A long time ago. And you made it? Clearly, she said with a smirk. Luca took a deep breath and stepped onto the narrow path. The wind howled around him, tugging at his clothes and threatening to pull him off the edge. He focused on keeping his balance, his steps slow and careful. Elara followed behind him, moving with the grace of a seasoned traveler. The cliffs seemed to stretch on forever, the path winding its way along the mountainside like a precarious thread. Luca's heart pounded in his chest, his muscles straining with the effort of keeping his balance. One wrong step, and it would all be over. Suddenly, a gust of wind slammed into him, nearly knocking him off his feet. He stumbled, his arms flailing for balance, and for a heart-stopping moment, he teetered on the edge of the cliff. But before he could fall, Elara's hand shot out, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him back to safety. "Careful," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The wind up here doesn't play nice." Luca nodded, his heart still racing. "Thanks." They continued on, the wind growing fiercer with each step. The cliffs seemed to taunt them, the drop below a constant reminder of how close they were to death. But finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the end of the cliffs and found themselves standing at the entrance to a narrow cave. "This is it," Elara said, her voice low. "The entrance to the Temple of Light." Luca stared at the cave, his heart pounding with anticipation. He was so close. So close to saving Mira. Luca took a deep breath and stepped into the cave, the darkness swallowing him whole. Elara followed closely behind, her presence a quiet comfort in the otherwise oppressive silence. The air inside the cave was cold, damp, and filled with the faint scent of something ancient, something untouched by time. Luca's hand brushed against the stone walls as they walked, and he felt the smoothness of the surface, worn down by centuries of wind and weather. The cave twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the mountain, and with each step, Luca's anticipation grew. He was close, so close to the light of wish that he could almost feel its power. Myra's face filled his thoughts, her smile that had once lit up their home now a distant memory. He pushed forward, refusing to let himself think of failure. The path finally opened up into a vast chamber, and Luca stopped in his tracks. Before him stood the Temple of Light. It was massive, its stone walls glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. The roof stretched high above, lost in shadow, and at the far end of the room stood an altar, atop which rested a single, glowing stone, the Light of Wish. Its glow was soft but undeniable, like the last rays of a setting sun. Luca's heart raced. He had made it. This was it. The stone that could save his sister. But before he could take a step forward, a voice echoed through the chamber, deep and resonant, filling every corner of the room. "Who dares to seek the power of the light?" Luca froze, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his sword. The voice was not human, it was ancient, commanding. He turned, searching for its source, but the room remained empty. "I am Luca," he called, his voice steady despite the fear crawling up his spine. "I seek the light to save my sister." A figure appeared at the far end of the room, materializing from the shadows as if it had always been there. It was tall and cloaked in robes of pure white, its face obscured by a glowing hood. The figure was otherworldly, like a ghost given form. "I am the guardian of light," the figure said, its voice reverberating through the chamber. "Those who seek the light must prove their worth. The power you seek is not freely given." Luca stepped forward, his hand tightening on his sword. "I'll do whatever it takes." The guardian raised a hand, and the stone altar began to glow brighter. "This is not a test of strength, warrior. It is a test of your heart." Before Luca could respond, the room shifted. The walls blurred, and the ground beneath him seemed to dissolve into mist. When his vision cleared, he found himself standing in a different place entirely, a village, unfamiliar but hauntingly real. It was burning. Flames licked the rooftops of wooden houses, and screams filled the air. Luca turned in confusion, searching for some sign of what was happening, and then he saw them, people, villagers, running from the flames, their faces twisted in fear. But there was no one coming to save them. Suddenly, Myra's face appeared in his mind, her frail form lying in bed, and Luca felt a sharp tug in his chest. He was torn between the desire to rush to her side and the horror unfolding in front of him. These people, they were real. They needed help. But his sister, she needed him too, the guardian's voice echoed in his mind. You must choose, Luca. Save the village or save your sister. One will perish, the other will live. Make your wish. Luca's heart pounded in his chest, his mind reeling. The choice was impossible. He couldn't lose Mira, not after everything he had done to get here. But how could he turn his back on the villagers? How could he stand by and watch them die when he had the power to help? His hands trembled as he gripped the hilt of his sword. This was the real test. It wasn't about his strength or his ability to fight, it was about his heart. Luca closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He thought of Myra's smile, the way she had always looked up to him, trusting him to protect her. And then he thought of the village, of the people screaming for help, innocent lives that would be lost if he did nothing. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Mira wouldn't want him to save her if it meant sacrificing others. She would never forgive him for that. She would want him to do what was right, even if it meant letting her go. I choose. Luca's voice cracked, but he forced the words out. I choose to save the village. The flames around him vanished, the screams fading into silence. Luca opened his eyes, and he was back in the temple, standing before the guardian. The figure was silent for a moment, as if considering his choice, then nodded slowly. You have passed the final test, the guardian said. The true power of the light is not in granting wishes but in revealing the heart of those who seek it. The stone on the altar began to glow brighter, its light filling the room. Luca stepped forward, unsure of what to expect, but as he reached out to touch it, the guardian spoke again. Your sister's fate is not in your hands, Luca. But you have shown the strength of your heart. That is the greatest miracle of all. Luca's hand hovered over the stone, his chest tight with emotion. He had come all this way, faced countless dangers, and now, at the end of it all, he realized that the light of wish wasn't a solution. It was a reflection of his own journey, of the strength he had found within himself. Slowly, Luca lowered his hand. The stone's glow faded, and the temple fell into a soft, serene darkness. He turned to the guardian, his heart heavy but resolute. I understand now, Luca said quietly. The real miracle isn't in the stone. It's in the journey. The guardian nodded, its form beginning to dissolve into the air. Go, warrior. You have the strength to face whatever comes next. Luca felt a strange sense of peace settle over him as he turned away from the altar. Ilara stood at the entrance of the temple, watching him with an expression that was half amused, half respectful. Looks like you found what you were looking for, she said, her voice softer than usual. Luca smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. I didn't find what I thought I would. But I found something better. They left the temple together, the wind cold but no longer harsh. The journey back down the mountain was quiet, Luca lost in his thoughts. He wasn't sure what he would find when he returned to the village, but he knew that whatever happened, he had the strength to face it. By the time they reached the village, dusk had fallen, and the familiar sights of home filled Luca with a bittersweet longing. He made his way to the small house where Mira lay, Elara staying behind to give him space. He entered quietly, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. Mira's frail form lay still on the bed, her breathing shallow but steady. Luca knelt beside her, taking her hand in his, and for the first time in weeks, she stirred. "Luca." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to bring tears to his eyes. "I'm here, Mira," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm right here." She smiled weakly, her eyes fluttering open. "Did you find it?" Luca hesitated, then nodded. "I found it. But the real miracle wasn't in the stone. It was in everything we've shared, everything we've been through." Mira's smile widened, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I always knew, you didn't need a miracle. You just needed to believe." Luca held her hand tightly, his heart breaking and healing all at once. He sat with her for hours, telling her stories of his journey, of the trials he had faced, of the strength he had found along the way. And when her final breath came, it was peaceful, her hand still warm in his. In the days that followed, Luca felt a quiet strength growing inside him. He had lost his sister, but he hadn't failed her. He had honored her with every step he had taken, every choice he had made. And as he stood at her grave, the wind whispering through the trees, he knew that she would always be with him, in his heart, in his memories, in the strength he had discovered. The light of wish had shown him that miracles didn't come from stones or magic. They came from love, from sacrifice, from the courage to face the hardest choices. And that was the greatest gift of all.